Welcome back to On The Fly. We're previewing the predicting and recapping World Junior Championships, our Men's World Championship, the Women's World Championship, the U18 Men's World Championship. Expect the unexpected.
Absolute abomination of the Canadian Junior Nationals.
I have a couple extra words I want to use on that one. And it's Freebird. Freebird. Of course, the Olympics are just around the corner. I'm going to coin it the rivalry day.
World Junior history!
Your home for international hockey. This is On The Fly.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to On The Fly, your home for international hockey. I'm your host, Parker McLean, and you're listening to episode number 1 of the On The Fly International Hockey Podcast. Today we're going to be diving into the lower division tournaments, looking back on the Olympics, and answering your live questions towards the end of the program today. If you're hanging out with us live on YouTube, thank you for being here on this Sunday morning, or perhaps the afternoon, depending on where you're watching from. Please do smash the like button, hit the subscribe button to join our community here on YouTube. If you're catching us over on our Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. You can also find us on Instagram, X, and TikTok at OnTheFly1515. But with that, before we get too far into it today, I did want to talk a little bit about what this podcast is going to be about. And I think, obviously, it's a new one, right? And episode number 1 of this program. So a little bit about what we're going to be doing here on this program is more so covering the lower tournaments. And for those who've followed us for a while, especially on the YouTube side, know that we do a lot of the top division tournaments. We do actually all the top division tournaments now, covering all sorts of different content, kind of the day recaps, the team previews. So those will still continue. The only difference is that this podcast will serve primarily to recap some of those tournaments later on as well. Kind of talk through a little bit of the lower division tournaments, and we got a few that are currently going onward. We have a few that finished up over the Olympic break, and so there is lots to talk about from this past little while, especially in the international sphere, where there are a lot of tournaments that go on over the course of a given year. We will be breaking all of that down and more on this podcast as the weeks and the years go onward. So please do hit the like button, subscribe on YouTube, follow us over on our Spotify and Apple platform as well. And yeah, so we'll get into it today. We'll start here with topic number 1. And that's not it. For topic number 1, we have the Men's U18 Division 3B, which wrapped up over the Olympic break. The event happened from February 13th to 19th. And so you look at this tournament, and obviously the low end of the Division 3B, the team who ended last year, still stayed up, no relegation. And this year they shifted to a new format where you had 3 different teams, you had staggered groups, and it was a bit of a kind of that field test level where it was going to be fascinating to see whether or not they were going to find a new kind of home there for something that they were going to continue with going forward. And I think you look at this tournament, lots of kind of headlines, especially at the lower end of the division. You see a lot more of that kind of parity separate. And so I wouldn't say that it was terribly unsurprising to see the results, and we'll talk through some of them now. I will start here on the opening day on February the 13th. Turkmenistan played against South Africa, a 4-3 win for Turkmenistan in this one. But you look at this game, and I would say that in many ways, South Africa really shot themselves in the foot in this one, collecting 72 penalty minutes, 2 major penalties. And outside of those penalties, South Africa played really well and very well should have probably taken this game, but unfortunately for them, just found themselves in a little bit of penalty trouble. You know, you take 11 penalties in a game, it's probably not going to end up going your way. So I think, yes, South Africa ends up losing this game, and obviously we'll shift to the standings shortly, but it was a big first loss for them, especially as they look to try and earn their promotion up to the Division 3A level. Not quite going to be the case after you lose the opener. Typically, you have to win all your games. If not, you lose one to a weaker team. And so for South Africa, yes, they very well could have found their way back. But we'll talk a little bit more shortly about why they, of course, didn't. And then to the other two games from the day, from Iceland defeating Luxembourg 12-1, Thailand beating Bosnia 12-3, and it wasn't pretty games in either of those two either. You look at the scores, and they really do speak as to the final result of this one. And blowout games, especially evident, we see it quite a bit on the lower end level side. And so, well, not to say terribly surprising, but then you shift over to the next day on February the 14th, Iceland taking on Turkmenistan, 5-1 victory for Iceland. And in this game, it was pure domination from Iceland. And you look at it, they outshot them, I think it was 55-21, and it was a dominant performance as well. And those are the kind of games that you want to see for teams that are trying to find their way up at this tournament, to have that kind of dominant type performance. And so in many ways, it was a great performance from the Icelandic team, and they were going to look to continue that going forward in the tournament. You also, of course, add in the fact that for a team like Turkmenistan, they are coming off of a big win against South Africa. And so big win against South Africa, followed up with a bit more of a tough loss against Iceland, but in the end, still a great performance by Iceland, dominating that game, winning 5-1. Then Thailand and South Africa, after a bit of a tough loss against Turkmenistan the day before, we were going to see what they were going to be able to do against Thailand. And you look at this game, and it was a tough game to play. And Thailand's a very good team. Of course, they end up earning their promotion later in the tournament, but a very tight game between these two. Thailand definitely outshot them, but you look at the quality of chances, and South Africa was right there with them. And it was sort of that storyline of the tournament, I'd say, for this South African team, is a lot of chances, just when they got those opportunities, couldn't quite bury it. And for a team like Thailand, very similarly too, where they had quite a few chances in this game as well, just didn't quite get, when they got those chances, weren't able to quite bury them. They did walk away with this one. Thailand did at least 4-2 the win. And then to the third game of the day on February the 14th between Bosnia and Luxembourg. Bosnia did win 7-6 in overtime. And I mean, this game was a crazy game. It was a 5-0 comeback. Of course, Bosnia was up 5-0. Luxembourg storms all the way back 6-5. And then in the final 13 seconds of that game, Bosnia ties it and then goes out and wins it in overtime. It was a tremendous game to watch. And one that was kind of one of those edge of your seat type games where you didn't know what was going to happen next. Luckily, you still come out with the win, but it was one of those crazy games, especially for Bosnia, where you almost blow a 5-0 lead. Of course, you storm back, you end up taking it. Everything is sunshine and rainbows, but still a very tough game for this Bosnian team to try and put away Luxembourg. And luckily for them, they hold on in the end. They get the overtime win. They do bleed a point, but I think you'd be okay with that, especially, of course, considering what ends up happening at this tournament. Then to the last day of preliminary round action between South Africa and Luxembourg. South Africa in the eventual relegation round rematch, they did take it 7-3. Bit of a kind of that blowout type performance. It was tight early in this game, but as it went onward, definitely favored the South African team. They found themselves into a few goals and really ran away with it from there. Then Thailand and Iceland, 4-2 win for Thailand in this one. This was a huge game coming in for both teams. Huge standings implications, huge kind of momentum shift. And we talk a lot about on this channel, but the top divisions, that is kind of like a USA-Canada where you want to set the tone going forward. Thailand and Iceland very similarly, kind of one of those games that you want to see the best be the best. And two of the top teams coming into this tournament, two teams that are fighting for that promotional spot. And so you want to set the tone for that eventual rematch for the gold medal. I think they did just fine there. And then to the last game between Bosnia and Turkmenistan. Bosnia did take it 3-0. Bosnia did play really well in this game, outshot them 49-21. And it was a bit of that kind of blowout type performance, despite the scoreline being relatively close. It is definitely a performance I think Bosnia will walk away happy with after this tournament is done. But then Of course, the sort of standings, if you will, Thailand in first place with 9 points, Iceland in second with 6, Bosnia in third with 5, Turkmenistan in fourth place with 3, South Africa in fifth place with 3 points. Of course, Turkmenistan had the tiebreaker over South Africa because they beat them, and Luxembourg in the last spot with 1 point, which then shifts us over to the playoff picture. Mind how the playoff picture works. Top spot plays against the fourth seed, second and third play each other. So Thailand took on Turkmenistan, Iceland played Bosnia, and part of the new format also included the relegation game, which was a 2-game day, and so a kind of 2-game series to end up deciding the playoffs, decide who gets or in the relegation spot at the 3B level. And so we'll start here with kind of that relegation, and we'll move over, of course, the playoff picture after. But Luxembourg did take the opening game of the relegation round, 6-2 the final. This was a game that was close, and really both these games, despite the score lines, were very close games that ended up just getting decided by a few goals one way or another. And so you look at it for this Luxembourg team, they had their opportunities throughout this tournament. You can think back earlier in their game against Bosnia, a chance there to kind of get themselves thrusted up in the standings. Unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get the job done. And so that 3 points was a huge 3-point swing that could have very well had some pretty big standings implications to it. Unfortunately for them, not quite being able to get the job done. For South Africa, this game was kind of that wake-up call type game. And of course, 6-2 final, you go into the next day, and that's part of the beauty of this 2-game relegation series, is that then you have to play them again on the very next day. The difference is for South Africa is that they end up taking this game, and they win it 10-2 in overtime. You might be wondering, well, how is it overtime? Is that a typo? But the way that it works, once again, is a 2-game series. Both teams get the 3 points. They both get the win. And then from there, you have to play an overtime period. And so this game really ended 9-2. You add in the overtime goal at the end. And South Africa will avoid the relegation spot. If there is an eligible team to be promoted at the men's U18 level, they will replace Luxembourg at next year's tournament. But time will tell there to see what's going to happen there. They are the current relegation spot at this year's tournament. And then to the other games and some of the more playoff picture type games. And we start here, of course, with 2 big, I'd say, pretty big blowout games between Thailand and Turkmenistan. A huge win for Thailand off the top, a 14-0 victory for them. And then, of course, you go to the second game between Iceland and Bosnia, an 8-2 win for Iceland over the Bosnian team. This one was not a pretty game either, and it was one of those type games where you look at it and you say, this could have been one of those kind of competitive type games. But in the end, Thailand, Iceland, 2 teams destined to be facing off for the promotion spot, unfortunately just couldn't quite get the job done. And they, of course, Thailand and Iceland both move on to the gold medal game, try to earn their shot for promotion. The other 2 teams, Turkmenistan and Bosnia, play each other for the bronze medal, which then brings us on to that bronze medal game between Bosnia and Turkmenistan. It was a 4-1 victory for Bosnia. They did lock up the 3rd place spot at this year's tournament. But this game here was one that very much so was kind of that, I'd say, penalty galore-ish type game where both teams' discipline was not really their friend in this one. And one of those games that, yes, it could go either way, and you give each team gave each other a ton of chances, but it also matters how you finish on those chances. And we didn't really see that in this game, and so we saw it kind of in favor of this Bosnian team, I guess, but you look at it for both sides, Turkmenistan as well, just looking to try and earn their way back up and find themselves to the Division 3A level. And unfortunately, you go to that bronze medal game, not a whole lot to play for, and especially when you look at it at the U18 level, it's a little bit different where each team you bring is a little bit different. And so as much as, yes, this year might be a certain team, you're going to see the next year a pretty new crop of players. Yes, there'll be quite a few returning players as well, but it'll be exciting to see kind of how those 2 teams shift out, especially going forward, see if they can earn their promotion back up to the Division 3A level. I'm not sure it's coming very soon. I think you look at it, Iceland's kind of that obvious team that has been knocking on the doorstep for quite a few years now. just hasn't quite got there. I think you also look, of course, to Thailand, who's trying to get back up, and they are now up at the Division 3A level. And we'll talk about that game now, with Thailand beating Iceland 4-3 in overtime. And this game was one of the better games from this tournament, I'd say. And you look at the skill level, kind of a comparative factor. And for Thailand, I'd say in many ways it was one of those competitive type games. I wouldn't say that they really dominated in any fashion, but they were competitive as much as they needed to be. They played their systems, and in the end, they did take it 4-3 in overtime, taking the gold medal, earning the promotional spot, and so a huge deal for them. And I think in many ways, that's what you want to look for, especially for a team like Thailand who's trying to earn their way up and try and stay up, is that it's just a matter of how far you can really get. And they end up taking the top spot. They will earn promotion to the Division 3A level for the 2027 tournament. And so a huge congrats to them on that. As we will now show the final rankings, at least for now. Obviously, none of the other U18 men's tournaments have gone on as of this point. However, we look at that bottom row for our viewers on YouTube. But you see Thailand with the promoted spot, 42nd, 43rd, 44th, 45th. Iceland, Bosnia, Turkmenistan, South Africa rather, and then Luxembourg in that kind of last spot, the team that would eventually be replaced if there is a new team jumping up into that level. So unfortunately for Luxembourg, a bit of a tough tournament, a lot of chances, just couldn't quite get the job done, really, kind of was what it ended up coming down to. We will now shift to the next topic of today, with the Women's World Championship Division 3A, which is another tournament that's been going on for really quite a few days now. And it's been a pretty good one, I'd say, to this point. February 23rd to March 1st, happening in Croatia. And this has been a tournament as well where I'd say this one, compared to the 3B level, is always going to be a little bit more competitive. You look at a 3A level, the parity is a little bit closer as far as that talent gap goes, especially when you look that's not the bottom of it, and there's teams that can go underneath, and so you tend to weed out kind of those weaker teams. But especially on the big level, the national best on best level, we tend to see teams kind of take that next leap. And I wouldn't say that there's really been any one team at this year's tournament, even coming into today, where it's been a kind of a dogfight for that top spot. And there was a huge win this morning by Thailand to knock off Turkey, where all of a sudden this entire tournament has now been flipped onside its head. And so it's going to be interesting to see. So it should be really interesting whether or not coming into today, there's a huge game coming up later in the day to decide who ends up getting that top spot. There's a huge game coming up earlier, and actually I believe it just started as of the time of filming this recording, that it's going to depend who gets into that relegation spot, who goes up. Should definitely be fascinating to see. But we'll walk you through this tournament now. Of course, we will start here with the opening day, February the 23rd. Turkey took on Serbia. This one was definitely a slight edge to the Turkish team, but still a dogfight type game that very much could have went either way, and a really well played game there by Turkey to end up taking this one 4-2, the final in that one. Then Romania and Bulgaria, 5-1 win. Romania dominated this game, 49-13. Were your shots in this one. A very tight game, I'd say, too. But in the end, the just kind of edged out. And then Thailand and Croatia. And Thailand picks up a big win, a 2-1 victory at that, and it's a huge win for them in this tournament. And so, for this Thai team, you look kind of further down the line. This tight game ended up really cementing themselves with the possibility to move forward in this tournament. A huge game for them. Turkey and Romania, 4-3 win on February the 24th. Desperation, I'd say, kind of towards the end for the Romanian team, brought it a little bit closer. They ended up tying the game late, but Turkey just kind of were able to kind of fend it off. Romania was the better team, I'd say, in this game, but unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get the job done near the end. Then you go to the next one, Serbia and Thailand, a 4-3 win in the shootout for the Serbians. Thailand really dominated this game. Unfortunately, kind of the storyline of the tournament that we've seen from them is just not being able to get those chances. And it kind of reminds you, if we're kind of doing that top division comparison, of the Japanese women's team, who has had some troubles, especially over the last few years, at finding the back of the net, and when they get those chances, really burying them. I think that's one where you really look at it and say there's a bit of a problem there, and so that is an issue, and we saw that throughout this tournament really. But they are where they need to be going into the final day. We'll see with a little bit of luck if they can get there. Croatia against Bulgaria, 2-1 shootout win for the Croatians. But Croatia did dominate this one, 50-15 were your final shots there. Not really that much of a tight game, despite the score. Croatia really took control of the pace, but once again, just unable to find that kind of last burying chance that would have been the difference maker in this one. Then to the 26th, we had Thailand beating Bulgaria 7-4 in that one. Another dominant performance by Thailand, 49-23 were the final shots. There was a bit of a late comeback there, but in the end, Thailand ends up taking this game 7-4. Romania against Serbia, a 3-2 win for Romania over Serbia in a shootout. This game was about as tight as you were going to get. A very competitive game right to the very end. Could have went either way, really, but in the end, a big win. And yes, it's in shootout fashion, so you end up splitting points. But you think about the importance that 1 point gives you, one tiebreaker gives you as well. And so for a team like Romania, that very well might be the difference between them getting relegated at this tournament and them end up making it on to another year, or potentially going all the way. Time, of course, still remains to be seen on that one. Croatia against Turkey, a bit more that kind of blowout type game. Special teams were really the storyline of this game. 5 of the 6 goals came off of special teams. There was a couple shorthanded ones in there as well. So a really, really fascinating game to watch, just how much special teams ended up dominating that. And then you move kind of the rest of the way. And February 27th for yesterday's games, or 2 days ago's games, I guess now, Romania took on Thailand. Romania won 2-0 in that one. Really was a coin flip type game. Romania came on strong in the third period and ended up taking back the lead in that game. Definitely a tighter game, but in the end, it's part of the beauty of it. Is really just how well the Romanians played all tournament. Unfortunately for them, lost one game kind of earlier on in the tournament in a bit of an upset fashion, and just couldn't quite find their way back. And then you move over to Turkey taking on Bulgaria. It was somewhat tight. I wouldn't say that it was really a dominant performance one way or another, but in the end, Turkey comes through with this one, a 4-1 win, a big 4-1 win at that, which set them up golden going into the final day. Croatia taking on Serbia as well. Croatia took it 5-3. Croatia out of the empty net late, but really this game was another one of those kind of tighter games. Could have went either way, but in the end, Croatia did take it, which then sets us up to today and this morning's game, where coming into this one, we talk coin flip a lot. This was one of those games that Turkey had a really good tournament. They had the opportunity to earn their promotion with a regulation win today. They had the advantage in points. All they needed to do was win regulation against Thailand, and they'd be in the promotional spot heading up to the Division 2B level. Unfortunately for them, they weren't able to pull it off. A 3-2 loss this morning against Thailand, and this game was one of those kind of games, I'd say, where for this Thai team, they were looking for a chance. And in many ways, I'd say they really got their chance today, and it was a huge win for them. You also look kind of, as we flip to the standings now, what this means for them. Thailand currently sits in the top spot with 10 points. Turkey in the second spot with 9 points. They are done. Later today, Croatia will take on Romania. Either team wins in regulation, they will earn their top spot, their promotional spot. Croatia wins in overtime or a shootout, Croatia will not advance. Instead, Thailand will be the team who ends up advancing to the Division 2B level. So we could see late in the game, if it remains tied, Croatia end up pulling their goaltender. For Romania, if they win in any fashion today, they will be the promoted team. For Serbia and Bulgaria, they will play later today as well. If Serbia wins in any fashion or forces overtime, they will avoid relegation down to the 3B level. On the other, and for Bulgaria, they need a regulation win in order to stay out of the relegation spot at this year's tournament. And so it's all going to come down to this final day. It always does. It's part of the beauty of the structure of these tournaments. But a big few games coming up later in the day. There's one that's underway already with Serbia and Bulgaria taking on each other. And so we'll see, obviously, as this day progresses, kind of how this Division 3A Women's Worlds ends up shaking out. Huge deal on that side of the conference. And so good to see a bit of that kind of competitive side really come out onto the final day, which then shifts us on to the third topic of the day. And this is a little bit more of I'd say, a new type tournament. It's a few days in. And this is the Women's Worlds Division 3B level. And so Division 3B level has been on for 2 days now, really a day and a game, where this morning had one game. There's one that's also currently going on at the time of filming this video, or this recording. And so we'll take a look at it now. With yesterday's game, February 28th, Bosnia taking on the Philippines, a 6-4 win for Bosnia in that one. This was kind of a game where the Philippines just couldn't really find the back of the net. And yes, they score 4 goals, but they also outshot Bosnia 42-28 in this one. And it was one of those type games, I'd say, that if you are the Filipino team, you would have wanted a win out of this game, especially with the way you played. And credit to Bosnia, really, because they played their exact game that they needed to, and they came away with the win today. And that's the type of performance you need, and we saw it again today as well against South Africa. But they just find ways to win, and that's one of the hardest things to do, especially in this sport, especially at the lower divisions, is finding your way through and playing well enough to get those chances and end up pulling through. A huge win for them today, a 6-4 victory over the Philippines, and taking the opening 3 points of this tournament. Then on the second game between Estonia and South Africa, a 7-0 win for the home team on home ice. It's been quite the storyline coming into this one. And as well, I might also just add, for the Philippines, they were making their Women's World Championship debut at this tournament, and that first game, I'd say, really showed well for them so far. And then you go forward, right? And Estonia 7-0 win, a huge win for them, picking up the opening points of this tournament. In reality, it's probably going to be between them and Israel, as we'll go to the next game with Israel beating Singapore 11-0. 2 really dominant performances, but in the end, that game is probably going to end up deciding who goes forward in this tournament. You kind of look across the board, and Estonia, Israel, 2 teams very likely to end up being that kind of final game to decide the promotional spot. Should be interesting to watch. To say for sure, as today's game is currently underway. And once again, very well will end up deciding who goes forward in this tournament. And then today's game, Bosnia and South Africa, 3-2 final for Bosnia. Another big 3 points for them. And it kind of reminds you back to that point about, well, it's how do teams win, and if they can get the job done, that's really all that matters. And so you look at it for this Bosnian team, and they've performed, I'd say, up to, if not exceeded, expectations so far at this tournament. So a really well played tournament from them. We'll see if they can continue it moving forward as we flip to the standings now, with Bosnia with the 6 points leading the tournament so far. Israel and Estonia 3 points each, tied there. And then Philippines, Singapore both tied in 4th and 5th with 1 regulation loss apiece. South Africa, playing the extra game already, will be in that 6th spot with 2 regulation losses. You can expect one of those teams in 4th and 5th to end up tied with South Africa at the end of this. And Israel and Estonia, 2 teams will play each other today. One of them will most likely end up with Bosnia, assuming no overtime games end up happening there. But we will now move on to the Olympic talk. And For the Olympics, right? It's been a bit of a ride. We've made our final recap video on our YouTube channel for that. But I do also just quickly want to talk through a bit of the tournament as well. And so we'll start here from the Olympics with a couple of the surprises. And it's been quite the tournament for a few teams. It's been quite a disappointment for another, and we'll get to that in a few minutes here. But for the surprises, I'd say that there's no one better to start with than, I'd say, the biggest surprise of the Olympic Games. And we'll start on the women's side with the Swiss. And you look at this Switzerland team, and they were by far one of the biggest upsets coming in. And they weren't expected to be that contenderish, kind of that 6th-ranked team by myself, by a lot of the other people who cover this tournament. They were expected to lose to either Sweden, Finland, Czechia, Canada, and the US, kind of fitting underneath those 6 teams. And then you roll into this tournament, and I'd say it was a bit of that kind of competitive factor that we hadn't seen in quite a few years. And they played really well, and credit to them throughout this entire tournament, because they found ways to win. And huge win against the Czechs early on, competitive games against some of the best teams at this tournament. And then you roll into the quarterfinals. And quarterfinals, you have to go play the Finns. Not really expected to be contending with a team like the Finns, but sure enough, they find their way through. They get a big win, and then they find themselves the semifinals. They nearly upset Canada, 2-1 win for the Canadians in that game, and one that I wouldn't say any Canadian was really happy with the performance in that game, because the Swiss just played that kind of style that Canada can't really break through. And so for the Swiss, they nearly upset Canada not only once in the prelims, but also twice into that semifinal round. Then they go to that bronze medal game, and from that bronze medal game, it's that kind of storyline once again, right? And for that storyline coming in, it's a matter of, well, are they going to be able to beat the team that they weren't expected to beat at the start of the tournament? And we hadn't seen that game play out yet. We saw it earlier in the tournament, in that pre-tournament game, where, of course, the Swiss ended up beating the Swedes. But in the end, they didn't quite have their full roster. They weren't playing to win. And so there was a bit of a question mark around that game, I'd say, especially for myself, was the Swiss going to be able to go through, be the Group A team, and go and beat the Swedes? And They did, right? And credit to them. They end up with the bronze medal, despite being relatively unfavored throughout this entire tournament. They were by far the biggest surprises, I'd say, of this year's Olympic run for both sides, really. And you end up with the medal despite not being favored to make it through the quarterfinals. I think for them, it's a huge deal, especially for their program, kind of reinforcing that what we've seen for so many years from the Swiss team, because the Swiss have always been a good team, right? And there's not a lot to get around that. They've always been a good team. They've always been a really well-constructed roster with a little bit of that star talent factor that when it goes quiet, so does the Swiss team. But a tremendous tournament for them, a really impressive tournament, ends up with the bronze medal. Then on to the Swedes on the women's side as well. For the Swedes, they weren't expected to go as far as they did. A Group B team, they walk through for the most part their group in Group B in the prelims. Not really much of that competitive type game that we might be accustomed to seeing a little bit more. But then from there, you go into that quarterfinal game against the Czechs. That game was one that you wanted to avoid if you were the Swedes, but they pull through. They get the win. They play probably one of the best defensive performances we've seen at Olympic Games in quite a while against that Czech team. Maybe you can throw it to the other semifinal against Canada and the Swiss as well. But for the Swedes, they locked it down. And they got up, they locked it down, they played the exact game they needed to. End up going to, of course, the semifinals. They played the U.S., not expected to go through the U.S., a bit of a tight game or tough game for them. End up losing that one, blowout fashion, sure, fine. Next game, brush it off, go up against the Swiss, a team that, once again, you are somewhat favored to beat, but really it's one of those coin flip type games where it can go either way. In the end, of course, the Swiss end up beating the Swedes, but still a very impressive tournament for them. They get to overtime against the Swiss in the bronze medal game, despite being a Group A team coming into this tournament, or Group B team coming into this tournament, a really impressive performance from them, one that I'm sure could have went really either way in this one, and definitely a surprise from this tournament. For me, definitely the Swedish team on the women's side. And then I feel like there's no one better to talk about next than the Italian team. And speaking of Group B teams, where the Italian team coming in kind of around that 4th, 5th spot in Group B, not necessarily expected to contend with teams like Japan, not necessarily considered to contend with teams like France as well. And credit to the Italian team, they were a force at this year's tournament. They were a competitive team as well. And you can kind of look up and down the board really when it comes to this tournament. And their win against Japan, their win against France early on in the tournament really solidified themselves a playoff spot. And then from there, I mean, you look for the Italians that they made it to the quarterfinals, right? And I think that in and of itself, it didn't really matter what happened after that fact. I think in many ways, it's just a matter of, well, they did it. And now it's, can they keep it going? And we're going to continue to see them throughout these international tournaments. It wouldn't surprise me if they can keep a lot of their same team at the Women's World to see them up with the top group in a few years. So it'll be exciting to see, to say the least, for this Italian team. Definitely one to keep an eye on. And then, of course, the U.S. I have to throw in here, really for both sides. We'll transition from the women's side to the men's side. We'll start on the women's side for the U.S. team with probably one of the most dominant tournaments performances we have seen since, I think since the inaugural tournament in 98. I don't think there's been as dominant a performance at this kind of tournament as the U.S. team did. A blowout game in just about every one they played, 31-1 through the prelims. They continued it, another dominant performance throughout the rest of the way. And it was just one of those type tournaments for the U.S. that just seemed that everything was going their way. Everything was playing the way that exactly as they needed to. And it was really good to see for the U.S. that they are back and they continued their force. They blow out Canada in the prelims, I say was probably their biggest one. They blow out the Czechs, they blow out the Finns, they blow out the Swiss. And then they blow through the early rounds as well. The quarterfinals, a blowout. Sweden's a blowout in the semis. And then Canada, it was kind of their first taste of that adversity factor. And credit to the U.S. for sticking with it. They end up finding their way through. And it wasn't one of those pretty games. It wasn't one of those games you kind of take home and say, yeah, we won that game, and it was a pretty tight game. But in the end, you get the job done. And that's really all that matters at this kind of tournament, is you get the job done. A huge win for the U.S. on the women's side, taking home the gold medal game 2-1 in overtime. The Megan Keller golden goal for the Americans, and that pretty much solidified that gold medal win for them. One of the most dominant performances in history at the Olympic Games. Right up until the final game, I'd say. Outside of that gold, still that dominant performance, but still solidified the Keller golden goal. Solidified, I'd say, the most dominant performance in U.S. history as we shift now to the men's side. And for the men's side, the American team coming into this tournament, I'd say wasn't necessarily the most surprising team, and maybe surprising in a bit of a bad way. But then you get to the quarterfinals. And you got to go through the Swedes. And when you play the Swedes, it's never going to be an easy game. The U.S. slugs it through, right? And they get their Quinn Hughes game-winning goal in overtime. They going to go on to the semifinals where they take on the Slovaks. They pummel through the Slovak team. And then they go to the gold medal game against the Canadians. And they go up early. We see them do a pretty similar thing, I'd say, to what we saw them do against the Swedes, where they kind of box in. And once again, yes, you can do that, but you can only do that for so long against some of the better teams. Canadians tie it up. They have a lot of chances between then and the end of the third to end up kind of changing the tide. But in the end of it, the U.S. with Jack Hughes' golden goal puts them into the gold medal spot again. And the U.S. takes both tournaments this year, the women's and the men's side, a huge win for really the entire program. And then from there, it's been kind of that ride for this U.S. team, and we're going to see if they can continue it. Obviously, some pretty big tournaments coming up. The men's U18s coming up in April. The men's World Championships coming up in May. The women's Worlds coming up in November. I expect the Women's Worlds team to be pretty similar to what we saw at this most recent Olympic campaign. The only difference is that their counterparts in Canada not necessarily going to be quite the same. And so I think for Canada, we're going to see what they're going to be able to do. I just think that that team is going to look so different than what they are now that whether or not they're going to be competitive with this American team, I don't really know. I expect there to be a bit of that coaching change, but should definitely be interesting to see for the Canadian side going into the Women's Worlds tournament in November. But then to the men's side. And we talked a little bit about the U.S. already, but I think there's no one better on the men's side to talk about than the Slovaks at this year's tournament. And for the Slovaks, I'd say they were probably one goal away from not being where they were and not having as good of a tournament as they were. And it's part of the joy of covering these international tournaments is that you start to understand just how much one goal really makes or breaks a tournament. And we saw that in this one too, right? Where for the Slovaks, they played, I don't want to say a near perfect game, but a really well played game throughout this tournament. And they start the tournament with a huge win against the Finns, a game that I would say had some huge implications. But in the end, they walk through and they find themselves into the win against Italy. And that game wasn't a pretty one for the Slovaks. Then they play the Swedes. And their game against the Swedes, I wouldn't say they'd walk away terribly happy with it. They get the job done though, right? They stay within their goal. They stay within the 2 goals. They get that late goal on the power play. And then we see the Swedes in desperation mode pull their goaltender. Not quite going to be able to get much done there. But in the end, right, and part of the beauty of it, especially for the Slovaks, is that one goal means everything at these tournaments. They get their one goal. They move along, of course, to the eventual game against the Germans, right, in that quarterfinals. They blow the doors off of the German team, which then sends them on to the semifinals. And in that semifinal round, it's one of those type of games that I wouldn't say that they're really expected to win against the U.S. semifinals. But then it's a matter of, well, they don't win that game. So what can they do in that bronze medal game? And unfortunately for them, it wasn't in the cards to try and upset the Finns twice. The Finns end up taking the tournament, but still a very proud tournament for this Slovak team. And I wouldn't say that they would be sad with their performance in any stretch of the imagination. A really well-played tournament from them. Unfortunately, coming up just short at the end, not being able to take home the bronze medal. And then I think one other team, and there's 2 other teams that we'll talk about, but one other team that you're kind of looking at is Italy. And Italy at this tournament, another Group B team, not expected to do a whole lot, expected to be blown out for the most part, but they had a coach. And the beautiful part about European coaching and Jukka Jalonin's system is that it's very difficult to try and score goals against. And for a team like Italy, who is such a huge underdog at these kind of tournaments, that's the kind of style you want to see, and you want to have a good structured defensive system. So when you go against teams like the Slovaks, the Swedes, and the Finns, you're going to be able to play structured defense and be able to hopefully hold them within games to make it interesting towards the end. And credit to the Italians all tournament long, because they played a tremendous game. And they played arguably one of the best games they could have played. And so we'll see moving forward for the Italians. We'll see them at the Men's Worlds, whether or not they're going to be able to kind of make that next step and kind of be that perennial contender. Time will certainly tell. I'm very excited, to say the least, to see what's to come for this Italian team. And the other part that's interesting too that you add in is the fact that that team is predominantly Italian. And it's not like you're grabbing players from Canada. It's not like you're grabbing players from the US. It is, obviously, most of them have shifted over to Italy now, but you have that structured team now where you can work with them for years to come. And so I'm excited, to say the least, to see whether or not they're going to be able to continue that success moving forward. Definitely something to keep an eye on for this Italian team. Then to Switzerland with the performance, I'd say, over the results. And For the Swiss at this year's tournament, it's been definitely one that kind of got a wrench thrown into it in the game against Canada, losing Kevin Fiala. But you think about their first game against France, I wouldn't say they were terribly happy with it. The game against Canada, I'd say that they were pretty happy with their performance, just didn't quite get the results. That was kind of a difference maker, I'd say, in that one. Could have went either way for sure, but in the end, just a little bit too little, too late for the Swiss team, and they had their chance. They absolutely did. In many ways, they kind of outplayed Canada in that sense, but still a tough game for the Swiss to go up against a Canadian team and ended up walking out of there alive. But then you go to the Czech game, and for me, this is kind of where that huge tournament for them, we started to see the results swing in their favor. They end up beating the Czechs without Kevin Fiala, a huge win for them, as they kind of build momentum going into the playoff rounds. The game against Italy, I wouldn't say was their favorite game, to be completely honest, but one that they needed to win. And they found a way through. They got the win, which then brought them on to the quarterfinal game. And the game against the quarters, they're going up against the Finns. And the Finns, a very tough team to beat, a very structured team, but still a team that's beatable. And I think in many ways, that game against the Swiss, or that game against the Finns, was the exact game the Swiss wanted, and they played tremendously well. And so it's going to be exciting to see whether or not, of course, the Swiss, 2 back-to-back men's world championships, we'll see whether or not they're going to be able to continue that success going forward, because they nearly beat the Finns, right, in that quarterfinal game. And they led for most of it. They lost it towards the end, and then they lost in overtime. And one bounce, one way or another, throughout that entire stretch could have very well been the difference between the Swiss walking home with a bronze medal, or perhaps a silver medal too, and them walking away with nothing. And so for the Swiss, definitely a tournament to be proud of. Unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite find that one goal that kind of turned the tide. But still, a great tournament for them. Certainly a surprise of the tournament. But really, this entire tournament has been filled with surprises. A great tournament all in all, and one that I'm sure we're going to look back on in another 12 years and say, remember when NHL players were back? But of course, time will tell on that one as we shift now from our surprises segment to our disappointments segment. And this is one that I'd say there were quite a few disappointing storylines coming into this tournament, teams with high hopes that frankly let the job down. And I think there's no better place to start. We'll start again on the women's side with the Czechs. And for the Czechs at this tournament, kind of that clear-cut favorite as far as the teams underneath Canada and the US went. I'm trying to choose my words carefully in this, but I'd say you look at it for the Czechs, right? And the Czechs are a team who want to go far. And they were the team that could have upset Canada or the US at this tournament. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't even get out of the quarterfinals against the Swedes. They lose their game to the Finns, which I'd say that in of itself wasn't that bad of a loss. But that game against, you lose to the Swiss early on as well. But they beat the Finns. They end up slotting in against the Swedes. Third spot, great, whatever. They weren't going far. They weren't going to be able to get to probably beat or Canada or the US. But still, it was one of those type games, I'd say, that they look back on and wonder, hey, if we beat the Swedes, you end up playing Canada. And we saw what Canada was able to, or the Swiss were able to do against Canada. Could the Czechs do the same thing against the Canadian team? And I think that you look at the way the Czechs were composed this year, you look at the way Canada was composed this year, that first loss was a bit of a surprise, I'd say, I think to myself included, and it was a blowout game for the Canadians with the win, but that one I thought would be a lot closer. I thought the Czechs would play a much better game, and unfortunately for them, they just couldn't find their way back, and they couldn't find their way to that eventual rematch. So for the Czech team this year at this tournament, one that they're absolutely going to want back, their chance to kind of get back or get themselves on the podium for the first time in their program history. Coming into the tournament, I believe it was their 7th place, was the best finish they've ever had at the Olympic Games on the women's side. So unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get the job done, but one that I do think they will look back on at the end of these tournaments and say, well, that could have been our chance. And looking back in history, you flash forward a few years from now, that could have been our chance to go and do it and pull it off against a Canadian team that, frankly, wasn't that good this year. And I know they played really well towards the end, but that game was way too tight for the Canadians, and they didn't play all that well. And they hadn't played well all tournament, and the Swiss finally caught up and played at their best and nearly upset Canada in that game. I would have expected the Czechs to do somewhat of the same. Then, as we move along here to Japan, and for Japan, there were a team at this tournament, I'd say, that, they were probably one of those kind of bottom-feeding favorites as far as that Group B goes, to end up taking the group. Kind of in that favored top three. You never want to end up fourth or fifth. You don't make the playoffs. In the Women's Worlds, you get relegated. For the Olympics, you want to end up in those top three, so you play in the quarterfinals. Because when you get to the quarterfinals, really anything can happen. And unfortunately for Japan at this tournament, they just lost one game. And it's another story of them losing one key game early in the tournament that ends up shaking out the rest of it. And they lose, of course, against Italy. And the loss to Italy was the biggest loss. They beat France. They go through the gauntlet and they lose the rest of the games. But they couldn't lose the game to Italy because of the fact that Italy was always going to be kind of that third-ish team in the group. Japan was kind of that confident third spot unless Italy came above them. And so, unfortunately for Japan, that was their dogfight, and that was their game that mattered, and they lost it. And so, yes, you kind of look back on this tournament and say, well, what if, could if, should if, but in the end, they lost that one game, and that's kind of what threw their tournament. And it's a disappointing end of the tournament, another tournament for them, not ending up in that quarterfinal round, but they do want to definitely make a mark. And I think for Japan, you think about them being a Group A team not so long ago, that is probably one of the biggest blows they could have had, is the fact that they don't get that. So for Japan, a disappointing tournament, absolutely. We'll see moving forward whether or not they are going to be able to kind of keep it going and really find their way back at the November Women's Worlds, because they are creeping ever so much closer to a potential relegation spot, and they're going back to the snake format, the one in Group A, two and three in Group B, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So there will be a little bit less of that kind of pressure of being a Group B team, but still, they're going to need a big win in a bad way, and we'll see whether or not they're going to be able to get it done at the upcoming Women's Worlds. Then to the Finns, and I'd say for the Finns, I have to include them on this list. For me, they didn't play a disappointing tournament at all. They won the games they were supposed to. They lost the games they were supposed to. And in the end, they just lost the quarterfinals to a hot goaltender. And so, as much as their end performance and their end result was a bit of a disappointment, I wouldn't say by any stretch of the imagination that this tournament was a disappointment for them. Just kind of a tough game towards the end for the Finns. So for them, kind of thrown in there as far as disappointment goes, but I wouldn't consider them to be that much of a disappointment. Over to the men's side with Germany, I'd say for the Germans, they were the biggest disappointment on the men's side. Coming to this tournament, the Germans were a team that were pretty confidently supposed to be that second spot over in Group C, expected to be kind of a competitive team with the Americans, not necessarily supposed to win, but still be competitive. They had a brutal tournament. They should have lost to Denmark. They lost to Latvia. They got blown up by the US. They found their way through in that qualifying round game, and then they got pummeled by the Slovaks in the quarterfinals. And it was one of those tournaments that I wouldn't say the Germans really put together a good performance throughout that entire tournament. Yes, they come out with the win against Denmark, but you look at that game, and really the Danes outplayed Germany. And it's always tough for me to say, and I never like to say that a team should have lost when they won, but for that game between Denmark and Germany, the Danes sort of absolutely won. You look at their quality of chance, you look at their goaltending, they should have ended up coming out with that game, but unfortunately, they just couldn't get that job done. And the Germans walk away with the win in that game. They lose to Latvia, they lose to the US. They end up somehow, because of goal differential, in that second spot in the group. They get the easiest seed of the bronze medal game, and all of a sudden, there was hope. There was hope that they might be able to pull off an upset along the way, go through the Slovaks, who they're pretty close with, And then that game against Slovakia rolled around and they just got absolutely pummeled. A disappointing tournament for sure, I would say, for this German team, and one that they would absolutely want back throughout the rest of the way. But unfortunately, just a really tough loss for them. And they were by far one of the biggest disappointments from this tournament. Another one I'd say is the Czechs. And for the Czechs coming into this tournament, it was one of those type of tournaments, I would say, that you looked at it for the Czechs. They looked to try and be a medal contender. And I'd say they were a dark horse for gold, absolutely, because you look at the top 6 teams at this tournament between Canada, the US, Finland, Sweden, Czechia, and Switzerland. One of those 6 teams were very likely to end up in those top 3 medal spots. You could also add in the Slovakia and Germany as kind of those next 2 to end up in that bronze medal spot, or at least have a shot to contend for a medal with the upset potential. But in the end, the 6 teams were expected to be contending for gold. One of them was the Czechs. And they played arguably one of the worst tournaments they could have. They got blown up by Canada early on, right? And they got blown up by France. Or they almost lost to France. They let France back into that game. Probably tighter than what they would have liked, but they still found their way through that game. They lost to Switzerland, which I'd say was probably one of the most crushing losses of that tournament, but one that I think they almost needed to kind of get themselves back on track. They almost lose to Denmark in the qualifying. They end up making their way to the quarterfinals, where they got to play Canada. And yes, they end up playing great against Canada. I'd say more so to expectation than anything else, because frankly, they should be a competitive team with Canada. The way that they play, the way that their structure works, they're supposed to be a team that can definitely contend with Canada, especially if they can find the offense from their star talent, which they did in that quarterfinal game. And so really the only redeemable part of this tournament for the Czech team was that quarterfinal game where they nearly beat Canada. But really, that was about as tight as you could get without getting the win. They led for most of it, and unfortunately just found themselves on the wrong side of it. And that was the difference in this one. They end up losing the game in overtime to the Canadians, Mitch Marner, with that overtime winning goal. And unfortunately for this Czech team, just a little bit too little too late. They end with a pretty disappointing tournament, I'd say, more than anything else. And so, as much as yes, right, and I know it's kind of beating the dead horse here, but the Czech team is supposed to be a gold medal threat. The results side was a disappointment in and of itself, but still, they were a team that I think could very well walk away from this tournament looking at the final result against Canada and say it was okay, right? And I think it was okay for them in the end, but it took them too long to get going, and unfortunately for them, because of that, I do label their tournament as a disappointment. The other one who I do have to mention is the Swedes, but for the Swedes, I mean, their first game against Italy wasn't a great game, and I'm not going to claim it was. They had their chances, couldn't bury them. Sure, tough system to beat, Italian Finnish trap, whatever you want to call it, tough one to beat. Then you roll in, you go and lose against the Finns, a really tough one there. The Slovak game, I'd say you probably played the best you could have. Unfortunately, you just needed to win by a lot more goals than what you were going to beat the Slovaks by. And the late penalty hurt, absolutely. And I think that's one where you do kind of want it back. But when you have to beat a team by 3 goals and you're down 3 goals to start a game, it's definitely a tough one, just to say the least. So as much as, yes, the disappointment factor definitely there for the Swedish team because of the result, losing in that quarterfinal to the U.S. with Latvia in the qualifying, they beat them and went on to the U.S. game. I do think that you lose because of 1 goal, and because of that, I wouldn't say this tournament was a complete disappointment for them. I thought they played better and better as this tournament went onward. They took overtime against the gold medal winning team. They found their ways to be competitive as the tournament went onward. Unfortunately for them, 1 key loss against the Finns and 1 unfortunate goal for the Slovaks ended up costing the Swedes at this year's tournament. And I think that was the biggest difference between what we've normally seen from the Swedes, especially at these kind of tournaments, and what we saw this year. Definitely a tough one, to say the least. Then we'll move on to the next topic here with the injury factor. And for the injuries at this year's tournament, it has been a bit of a tough shoot. And coming into the tournament, I'd say the biggest thing, right? And one of the biggest things to keep an eye on was, well, what are the injuries like? And NHL players haven't been back in 12 years. PWHL season kicking off within the last 4 years. And so part of it is, well, is there going to be players coming back in the 2030 tournament? And I think, yes, I think we've seen the importance of having best on best, but there is a factor to also consider that teams pay players a lot of money. And the fact that you pay these players a lot of money means that you want them to be at their best when it matters most. And for those owners, it's not representing their countries, it's playing for their respective clubs. And that's been an argument made for the last several years as to why NHL players haven't gone to the Olympic Games. And I think it's continued into this year's tournament, where there have been some huge injuries to some very key players throughout the list. You can look on the men's side with Sidney Crosby, of course, kind of the obvious candidate. Kevin Fiala as well. Mikko Rantanen, who's another player who's gone down because of this Olympic Games. Josh Morrissey is on the IR now as well. And so there's a lot of players on the men's side that you're going to look at and say, well, the NHL has been pretty stingy with it in the past, so why wouldn't it continue going forward? And I think that, for me, is one that I look at and say, well, that could be a very big problem going forward, is the fact that you don't really know whether or not you're going to have that. And I think especially with the injuries, you need to know whether or not you're going to have your best players playing in arguably one of the biggest stretches as the trade deadline approaches on the NHL side. You need to have your best players being healthy, ready to play. So if you are making a playoff push, you can be ready to go. And I think that has always been a pretty big argument as to why NHL players haven't gone. But on the women's side, with the introduction of the PWHL, there's a whole different animal there as well. And I think you looked at it in a few different ways. The first is, for PWHL teams, they're looking to expand. So the growth of the game is huge. The best on best is one of the best ways to grow the game. Women's hockey is one that's absolutely growing. You can see it across our viewership on this channel as well, kind of as these years have gone onwards. But I would say more than anything else, you look at some key players once again. And we talked about the NHL side. We also have to talk about the PWHL side, right? And you look at players like Hillary Knight, who's out likely until the playoffs. Kendall Coyne-Schofield, who's also likely out until mid-March, likely will go farther than that. Marie-Philippe Poulin, day-to-day right now, but you saw that injury, you saw how she was playing. She's very far from being healthy. Erin Ambrose as well on the LTIR as well. And so there were a lot of injuries that happened during this Olympic run, and typically you don't really bat an eye on both sides just because we haven't seen NHL players at the Olympic Games, and the PWHL hasn't really been as big as it is now. But it is a huge deal, and it's going to become a pretty big problem for the IIHF at the Olympic Games to get those players in. And I think in many ways you look to it and say, well, what's to come and how can they ensure that to make sure that their best players are back? And I think the only logical answer, and the one that hurts me to say, is you don't end up sending the players there. And it becomes the question of, is the injury factor too severe to end up sending your players to a best-on-best tournament? And unfortunately, I think that there is a legitimate argument to be made. I don't know whether or not it's a legit question, if it will be addressed moving forward, but it is absolutely a topic that has to be discussed because it is probably one of the most on-topic issues right now. And injuries are huge, right? And injuries are huge at any point in a season. Injuries are huge coming into this tournament, right? And you look at a bunch of different players from across the leagues coming into this tournament at the Olympics where they weren't even invited or they weren't even on the roster because they got hurt right before the tournament started and said, well, I'd rather take 2-3 weeks and take some time off to make sure I'm ready to go. And unfortunately for them, they weren't able to participate. But in the same time, you also don't want to walk away from a 2-week quote-unquote break into an injury and then have to either play hurt the rest of the year or take time off to recover and make your team worse. So I think injury factor is huge, both on the men's side and the women's side in particular now, where we haven't really had that PWHL to kind of contract with. It should be interesting to see moving forward whether or not they are going to be allowing the best on best to continue playing at the highest level at these Olympic Games, and if the mid-season tournament will still continue to be a problem for the best on best. We shift in now to the overtime format, and this is one that I have quite a few words for, and we'll start with why. Why a gold medal game? Why a gold medal game 3-on-3 overtime? It is by far one of the dumbest things I have ever seen. And I know, yes, right? You have to get the game done. Closing ceremony's coming up. But when you play for a medal, you want it to be best on best and you want it to continue. And I can appreciate the fact that as a North American fan, we've had 5-on-5 overtime in the Stanley Cup Finals for years. And that's always kind of been that staple factor in overtime of a deciding game. And yes, that's great. But, when you are deciding arguably one of the most important tournaments in hockey, you want it to be best on best 5-on-5 for as long as you can go. Make it so that it's like in soccer, they have extra, or football, they have extra time. You play, you don't subtract the number of players, you continue to let them play. Yes, penalty kicks are part of that as well. I do think that as much as, yes, the IIHF doesn't want games to run long, I do think that at some point you do want 5-on-5 because it is so much better and it stops kind of that luck factor from coming out. And I can appreciate that luck is part of the game of hockey, but if you want to see the best on best play, you do need to incorporate some factor of 5-on-5 or 4-on-4 even. Make it a compromise, right? Where 4-on-4 hockey to decide the gold medal or even the bronze medal, right? And I think bronze medal games should be, maybe you do 4-on-4 for that. It does end in a goal fairly quickly, but I can also appreciate that they like to double schedule games on those days with bronze and gold happening in the same day. So if that needs to be 3-on-3, I can appreciate that. But I do still think that 4-on-4, 5-on-5 overtime is just that much better than 3-on-3, especially in a game that decides the fate of a gold medal. And you think kind of the concept of 3-on-3 is A, it's better for television, B, it's quicker, so it's better for television, and C, the game is faster and more exciting, which is also better for television. But still, if you're a hockey fan, and I'm sure many will agree with me on this, is we want to see the best on best continue to get to play at the highest level. So for me, a frustrating factor was the 3-on-3, and I can also appreciate that Canada lost both of them, and so it sounds a bit like whiny Canada fan that they lost both in the gold medal game, 3-on-3 overtime, but I have been complaining about this since the start of the tournament. I have been complaining about this during our live streams for these games because, frankly, it just isn't the right way to do it. If you're going to let best on best duke it out, make it an extra period, make it 2 extra periods, make it 3 extra periods. They don't decide in 3 periods, put it to 3-on-3, or maybe make it there's a US system where basically they do 5-on-5 for the first overtime, 4-on-4 for the second, 3-on-3 for the third. And once you get to 3-on-3 for that third overtime, then you go 5-on-5 again with no goaltender, 4-on-4 with no goaltender, 3-on-3 with no goaltender, and then from there it's just a bit of a disaster. But I think that could be a very interesting way to do it. If each period that goes onwards, you reduce your player by 1. I just think that they need a system in place that allows for the best on best to continue playing best on best hockey, instead of trying to jump the chute and trying to avoid it. I don't think that's really all that helpful, but what do I know, right? And I guess that's part of the fun of it is, frankly, you don't. And so yeah, that's my thoughts on the overtime format. Very much against it, and I can appreciate that. Once again, there is the factor of, well, the closing ceremonies were coming up very shortly, so you want to get everyone out by a certain time. Sure. Just make it 5-on-5 to start, then maybe throw in a shootout if you really need to close it out. Stop making it 3-on-3 overtime, because 3-on-3 overtime is very much luck-based too, and it's very much whoever gets the first puck tends to end up winning it. I'm not a huge fan of 3-on-3, and I don't claim to be, but unfortunately for Canada, 2 losses in the overtime, 3-on-3, so You can make your jokes at me if you so please with the overtime format, 3-on-3. Not a huge fan of it, to say the least. But we will shift into live questions. So if you are on our YouTube side, please do leave a comment or a question down in our chat box below, where we will answer your live questions for whatever you have for today, and we'll check our chat now. From Johnny, who says, "How are you doing?" And I'm doing excellent on this fine Sunday morning, where it is, I believe it was snowing earlier today. I believe it's back to being sunny now. So doing well. Glad to finally get this podcast out. It's been quite a few days over the last little while, I'd say, more than anything else, because it's been a busy few days, but happy to finally have got this podcast out. It's been quite the ways over the last few days. From Nick, "I'd like to see other IIHF tournaments push the gold medal game to the next day for the men's Olympics, so that the bronze medal games can go continuous 5-on-5 overtimes if needed." I completely agree with that. And I think that's part of it too, is you almost need it to be like that, where you need to have single days for the bronze and gold. And the women's side had it combined, the men's side had it spread out. And so I really thought that was much better. And I thought that you give each kind of thing a day, it does make it so that, both sides get their game and get their important game and don't have it decided by kind of that luck type factor. Wasn't a huge fan of it today, or a huge fan of it over the tournament. But hey, what do I know? From Johnny, I like the 3-2-1-0 point system of the IIHF. However, if you were to make a choice, would you split the point total? Would you split the points if still tied after overtime, or would you still do the same like the IIHF? I actually don't mind shootouts, and I know a lot of people don't like shootouts. I will also preface it with the fact that I don't like shootouts to decide gold medal games. I like the idea of overtime, continuous overtime in gold medal games and bronze medal games and medal deciding games. Playoffs, I can appreciate that there are time constraints as well, so you might need kind of that shootout type, or if you're going to run 10, 20-minute overtimes in the playoff rounds, I think that's another way to kind of engage people. But in the end, it is definitely something to keep an eye to consider, right? And for me, I personally enjoy a good shootout, and I think when you end it in a tie, I hate ties. I will never vouch for a tie, but I think you do need to find ways to end games quickly, and I think shootouts do a tremendous job with that. So I think there is definitely an argument to be made for the kind of the shootout, but in gold medal games and medal deciding games, I do think that they do need to kind of shift back into kind of that overtime, continuous overtime system, especially for medals, because medals are so much harder to win, and you never want it decided kind of by that luck-based factor. And obviously hockey is partly luck-based as well, but you always want it decided by best on best, having teams play mano a mano and seeing if they can get the job done. For me, that's always part of the best part of this tournament, or of these tournaments. Not a fan of 3-on-3 either, but preferred over the shootout. I don't mind shootouts for the preliminary round. Same, just referring to the gold medal game. And yeah, and I think part of it too is with the gold medal game is so much different, I'd say, than your average other game. And bronze medal, you can throw into that conversation, I think, a little bit less. And I'll be honest, I wouldn't mind 3-on-3 20-minute overtime periods for like continuous overtimes for the bronze medal game. I don't think the bronze has as much kind of stake to it, and obviously there is definitely stake to it, but I think you look at kind of the teams who contend for bronze medals, and you do want a little bit more of that luck-based factor involved, where teams for gold, not necessarily expected to be kind of luck-based. It's more of those skilled teams that end up in that spot. And so 3-on-3 overtime, not a huge fan for the gold medal, just because I think it is a little bit different. What I mean is in points-based games, only split the points if it goes to a shootout. Still 3 points if won in overtime and 0 if lost in overtime. Oh, I see what you're saying. I would say that the overtime part, I actually enjoy more, the 3-2-1 system, rather than the 2-1-0 system that North American leagues use. And I think overtime you want to try and avoid if you can. And I think that the NHL should actually adopt this 3-2-1 system or 3-2-1-0 system, because it encourages teams to not kind of allow both teams into the final picture, because you see it in the NHL, if the teams are tied within the last 10 minutes or so, it tends to end in that kind of overtime shootout frame. But if it's the other way, right, where if it's your team, if you're in the IIHF, you want to try and end it early so you get the extra point. It's more incentivizing teams to play their hardest for as long as they can. I think that's one of the big parts, one of the huge parts that you can definitely draw upon, and why I enjoy the 3-2-1 system rather than the 2-1-0 system, because you want to try and discourage overtime. And the 3-0 system would also do that. I just think that you need to give points for overtime and give teams credit for making it as far as they do. But I also think you want to make sure you're penalizing teams for getting to that stage and ending up winning it, so that an overtime or a shootout win doesn't count the same as a regulation win. Anything else? Let's see what we got here. Philippines are making their Women's World Championship debut. That's right. Switzerland and Sweden was a battle between two teams looking to shake off their past. That's absolutely right. And I think for the Swiss and the Swedes, it's been, for this Olympic run was definitely one of those kind of glory type runs for them, where they can be very happy with the way that they performed because of the fact that they've struggled for so many years. The Swedes getting relegated not so long ago. The Swiss really struggling over the last few years to get much going, but good to see them back and big on the big stage. What else we got? I think the Italian Hockey Federation, which would much rather have the actual Team Italy than a team who was only put together the same way the Chinese team was in 2022, and China has since stopped allowing those imports to compete for them. I think that's fair as well, and I think you think about it for the Chinese team and how they've kind of struggled to keep it going, and for the Italians, I think you get a lot of homegrown talent. It helps not only now, but also into the future. You get to introduce them to best on best, and although it's not necessarily the talent pool you're hoping to get, they did show that they could be competitive. They could be very dominant players really over the next few years, and I'm excited to see what they can do going forward as they do look to try and get on both sides to the top group. And once you're in that top group, you have to win one or two key games, and I think you look at it for Italy on both sides of the picture. The way that they played, they've definitely earned a chance, and they will eventually make their way back up. And I think I'm excited to see really what's to come for this Italian team, because they are quite good and they do have that opportunity. It'll be exciting to say the least. If you understand it deeply, the current NHL point system means only one team can drop points, while IIHF means both teams can drop points, if you understand. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's part of it too, is when you discourage it to get to that overtime shootout frame, is that you end up kind of giving it by the wayside, right? And you want to try and avoid it as best you actually can. So the NHL points, you don't discourage teams for getting to that overtime because you're only adding points, right? You're never actually losing points. The IIHF, you actually do lose a point. So I think that's kind of where that argument gets made. It'll be interesting to see. Because I do hope. I think that the NHL is definitely making a case for themselves. How would Team France look in 4 years, both women's and men's? I would say that realistically, the French are kind of in a bit of a pickle right now, where they have some talent, and they have some talent coming up. They got some good players, and then they have a lot more of those depth type pieces, but they need kind of one or two more key players, and that's what we saw at this most recent Olympic Games. Really for both sides, is you need that kind of one or two players that can make that big mark. And I think for the French, Division 1A on the women's side just got relegated from the men's worlds on the men's side. They have that opportunity to kind of make their mark in 4 years. They have a lot of players on the women's side that are young, they're growing. They have the kind of the talent pool and the prospect pool to get to that big stage. I just don't necessarily know if they are going to be at that point in 4 years' time. I don't know whether that's going to be too far off for them or too quick for them to get to that stage. But I do think that definitely a possibility to see them back up in the top group and causing some problems up in the top group as well, I may add. Should be interesting to see what's to come there. But that will wrap it up for us today. Wrap it up for episode number 1 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast. A huge thanks to everyone who hung out with us in the live chat today, and for those listening over on the audio version of the program. If you enjoyed the breakdown of the lower division and our Olympic recap, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube and turn on notifications so you never miss a live stream. For our listeners on Spotify and Apple Podcast, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. Don't forget to follow us at On The Fly 1515 on Instagram, X, and TikTok for highlights and news throughout the week. I am your host, Parker McLean, and until next time, see ya.